Hi, I'm Corey Reeser, and this is my second screencast reflection for my fieldwork observations that are tied into the lesson that I taught regarding the Bill of Rights for the 5 pedagogical lessons that are required to have been taught in EDU 476. So, I taught this lesson on the Bill of Rights. I actually divided this up into two segments because the Bill of Rights covers Amendments 1 through 10 to the U.S. Constitution. And in order to address the EL and special needs requirements for my first period class, which is what I'm offering a reflection for, being that there are, I believe 12 EL or special needs students in that class, it was pretty advantageous of myself to divide this up into two segments. That way, those students would be able to develop a fundamental understanding of the content material, and that I would be able to provide the necessary reinforcement that they would need in order to meet the requirements for the daily objective. So, like I've identified previously in my first period class, that's my American government. This is not an econ class. This is my American government class. I do not teach all American government. I actually have them divided into American government and econ. But for the purposes of this reflection, the Bill of Rights, I actually incorporated the application of theory, basically knowing my students. So my background in law is not really, my background in law, my background as an undergrad, and my background growing up are not any way reflective of the students that I teach. So basically, in order to communicate this material, which was written by a bunch of white guys, I had to modify and refine my skills and really think about how I was going to communicate the core concepts of the Bill of Rights, because from a student's perspective who's Hispanic or Latino, they're just a grouping of words that represent a paragraph and some type of archaic legal concept. And in order for me to break down that barrier, I had to formulate reference points for the students regarding their surrounding communities that they would be familiar with, and give them concepts that they would be familiar with. So if a right was violated, it wouldn't be very appropriate for myself to use a circumstance or scenario that the students would not be familiar with in any shape or form. So if I'm using securities fraud, students wouldn't even know what securities fraud is, because none of their parents most likely are heavily involved in stock market purchasing and selling. So the Bill of Rights, lesson 1 through 5. Here's the agenda. I start off with a PowerPoint introduction to constitutional interpretation. This is important because it identifies how the Supreme Court justices, who are the final say when it comes to constitutional law, how they apply different methods of constitutional interpretation and what those methods are and what they could possibly look like. I then give a PowerPoint presentation for amendments 1 through 5 and analysis of those very amendments. And then I led the class, a pretty significant classroom discussion on the limitations of amendments 1 through 5. And the purpose of this was basically I would throw out a question or a hypothetical, and if students didn't answer appropriately, I would start calling on students and asking them, what do you think? What are your opinions regarding this scenario, and do they agree or disagree with the conclusion that was made? So this is basically a way of allowing the students to ask questions, especially the EL students, from a reference point that they are familiar with. So if I used a legal concept that they were unfamiliar with, they could simply raise their hand and say, how was this aspect of this amendment, how does that reference to this situation? So that was the whole purpose of the classroom discussion on amendments 1 through 5. So start off, here's the objective that I used for the students, that they would understand the primary applications of amendments 1 through 5 of the U.S. Constitution, and that they would be able to identify the primary methods of constitutional interpretation. So here was my introduction to constitutional interpretation. I went over text analysis, precedent, constitutional doctrine, logical reasoning, the living Constitution, and reliance on foreign law. And I did this because basically, this wasn't actually covered in the book that the students have, but I felt that this was extremely important because in one of my law courses that I had taken as when I was working toward my law degree, this was a fundamental aspect of understanding the Constitution, is you have to understand it from the standpoint of what the Supreme Court uses as means of interpretation. So, for example, precedent would be using a previous court decision's opinion to reinforce or legitimize a current court decision. Reliance on foreign law would be basically, what do other countries do, and we should apply that very same legal thinking to the U.S. Constitution. And I told my students that anyone can basically say that's unconstitutional, or, the Constitution doesn't merit that. But I told them that it is important to realize that if they want to make a legitimate claim on constitutional law, they have to use at least one of these 6 requirements for constitutional interpretation, or else it's just their unfounded, unverifiable opinion. So, and original understanding, which is 7 of them. And then as I moved through, once I identified this is how they are, or how the amendments to the Constitution would be interpreted by a jurist of the court, I went into the background of the Revolution, and then I used, it's an actual preview. It's a 2-minute and 30-second preview on the Ukrainian Revolution called Winter on Fire. And I showed the students this, basically displaying the Ukrainian Revolution to provide context on how they actually used the American Declaration of Independence, directly quoted the American Declaration of Independence in their own declaration against the Ukrainian government and the Russian government. So then I went through the amendments. As you can see, John Oliver, and I like to use a lot of funny quotes just so it draws these students' attention into the content. So it basically, instead of just like, write this down, I provide them like, there's this, and then here's something funny that actually is reference to what we are discussing. So I actually put a lot of time and effort in finding comical visuals that basically align themselves with the content material that I'm discussing. So I go through the amendments. I provide the actual text of the amendments, as you can see. So you have the actual text, and then I give an overview. So the purpose of this is so the students can see what the actual text of the amendment is like in legal terms. And then this is a more basic and fundamental view of the amendment process. So this is the moment of Zen, basically talking. It was a funny video from The Daily Show discussing the Second Amendment. So that was just some fun stuff for the students to kind of break up the lesson a little bit. And then you continue to move through each of the amendment processes. And I eventually came to the Fifth Amendment, and as you can see, there was a lot of material involved in this, so I spent a significant amount of time reinforcing the concepts of each amendment. And I found it pretty well served to actually interject videos that kind of reinforce what I'm trying to do, especially with urban students, because it gives them another frame of reference on top of what I'm already doing. And another important aspect to consider in terms of application of theory was that knowing students and meeting their needs was reflected in my ability to transfer archaic and meaningless information into relevant material that they could interact with and understand on a meaningful level. So that was my second reflection for EDU 476 Fieldwork Observations.